The Aeneid. Type of work: poem. Author: Publius Vergilius Maro. Born in 70 and died in 19 BC, before Christ. Type of plot: heroic epic. Time of plot: the period immediately following the Trojan War. Locale: the Mediterranean region. First transcribed: Augustan manuscript. Principal characters: Aeneas, Trojan hero destined to found the Roman race. Dido, queen of Carthage, in love with Aeneas. Anna, her sister. Ascanius, son of Aeneas. Anchises, father of Aeneas. Venus, goddess of love and beauty, mother of Aeneas. Juno, queen of the gods and enemy of the Trojans. Cumean, Sibyl, prophetess who leads Aeneas to Hades. Latinus, kings of the Latins, whom Aeneas defeats in battle. Lavinia, his daughter. Turnus, Latin hero, ambitious for the Latin throne and hand of Lavinia. Evander, Arcadian king, ally of Aeneas. Pallas, his son. Critique. This poem is the distinguished Latin epic which celebrates the glory of Rome in great poetry. It records the traditional story of the establishment of the Roman race and thus traces the lineage of the Romans back to Aeneas and Troy. It has already stood the test of time and will go down in history as one of the world's great epics. The story: Aeneas, driven by storm to the shores of Libya, was welcomed gladly by the people of Carthage. Because Carthage was the favorite city of Juno, divine enemy of Aeneas, Venus had Cupid take the form of Ascanius, son of Aeneas, so that the young god of love might warm the heart of proud Dido, and Aeneas come to no harm in her land. At the close of a welcoming feast, Aeneas was prevailed upon to recount his adventures. He described the fall of his native Troy at the hands of the Greeks after a 10-year siege, telling how the armed Greeks had entered the city in the belly of a great wooden horse, and how the Trojans had fled from their burning city, among them Aeneas with his father Anchises and young Ascanius. Not long afterward, Anchises had advised setting sail for distant lands. Blown by varying winds, the Trojans had at length reached Basrotum, where had been foretold a long and arduous journey before Aeneas would reach Italy. Having set sail once more, they had reached Sicily. There Anchises, who had been his son's sage counselor, had died and had been buried. Forced to leave Sicily, Aeneas had been blown by stormy winds to the coast of Libya. Here he ended his tale, and Dido, influenced by Cupid, disguised as Ascanius, felt pity and admiration for the Trojan hero. The next day, Dido continued her entertainment for Aeneas. During a royal hunt, a great storm drove Dido and Aeneas to the same cave for refuge. There they succumbed to the passion of love. Aeneas spent the winter in Carthage and enjoyed the devotion of the queen. But in the spring he felt the need to continue his destined course. When he set sail, the sorrowing Dido killed herself. The light of her funeral pyre was seen far out at sea. Again on the shores of Sicily, Aeneas bade his men refresh themselves with food, drink, and games. First of all, there was a boat race in which Cloanthus was the victor. The second event was a foot race, won by Euryalus. Entellus engaged dares in a boxing match, which Aeneas stopped before the obviously superior Entellus achieved a knockout. The final contest was with bow and arrow. Eurytion and Acestes made spectacular showings, and to each was awarded a handsome prize. Following the contests, Ascanius and the other young boys rode out to engage in war games. Meanwhile, the women were grieving the lost guidance of Anchises, and at the instigation of Juno set fire to the ships. Aeneas, sustained by the gods, bade his people repair the damage. Once more the Trojans set sail. Finally, they reached the shores of Italy at Cumae, famous for its Sibyl. The Sibyl granted Aeneas the privilege of visiting his father in the underworld. After due sacrifice, the two of them began their descent into Hades. At length, they reached the river Styx and persuaded the boatman Charon to row them across. Charon. Aeneas, if to read in German. Aeneas saw the spirits of many people he had known in life, including the ill-fated Dido. Then they came to the beginning of a forked road. One path led to the regions of the damned. The other led to the land of the blessed. Following this latter road, they came at last to Anchises, who showed Aeneas in marvelous fashion all the future history of the Rome, and commanded him to found his kingdom at a place where he would eat his tables. On his return to the upper regions, Aeneas revisited his men and proceeded to his own abode. Again, the Trojans set sail up the coast of Italy to the ancient state of Latium, ruled over by Latinus. On the shore, they prepared a meal, laying bread under their meat. As they were eating, Ascanius jokingly observed that in eating their bread, they were eating their tables. This remark told Aeneas that here was the place Anchises had foretold. Next day, the Trojans came to the city of King Latinus on the Tiber. Latinus had been warned by an oracle not to give his daughter Lavinia in marriage to any native man, but to wait for an alien who would come to establish a great people. He welcomed Aeneas as that man of destiny. A Latin hero, Turnus, became jealous of the favor Latinus showed Aeneas and stirred up revolt among the people. Juno, hating Aeneas, aided Turnus. One day Ascanius killed a stag, not knowing that it was the tame favorite of a native family. There grew from the incident such a feud that Latinus shut himself up in his house and ceased to control his subjects. Meanwhile, Aeneas made preparations for battle with the Latins under Turnus. In a dream, he was advised to seek the help of Evander, whose kingdom on the 7 hills would become the site of mighty Rome. Evander agreed to join forces with Aeneas against the armies of Turnus and to enlist troops from nearby territories as well. Now Venus presented Aeneas with a fabulous shield made by Vulcan, for she feared for the safety of her son. When Turnus learned that Aeneas was with Evander, he and his troops besieged the Trojan camp. One night, Nisus and Euryalus, 2 Trojan youths, entered the camp of the sleeping Latins and slaughtered a great many of them before they were discovered and put to death. The enraged Latins advanced on the Trojans with fire and sword and forced them into open battle. When the Trojans seemed about to beat back their attackers, Turnus entered the fray and put them to flight. But the thought of Aeneas inspired the Trojans to such bravery that they drove Turnus into the river. Aeneas, warned in a dream of this battle, returned and landed with his allies on the shore near the battlefield, where he encountered Turnus and his armies. Evander's troops were being routed when Pallas, Evander's beloved son, began to urge them on and himself rushed into the fight, killing many of the enemy before he was slain in combat with Turnus. Aeneas sought to take the life of Turnus, who escaped through the intervention of Juno. Aeneas decreed that the body of Pallas should be sent back to his father with appropriate pomp during a 12-day truce. The gods had watched the conflict from afar. Now Juno relented at Jupiter's command, but insisted that the Trojans must take the Latin speech and garb before their city could rule the world. Turnus led his band of followers against Aeneas in spite of a treaty made by Latinus. An arrow from an unknown source wounded Aeneas, but his wound was miraculously healed. The Trojan hero re-entered the battle, was again wounded, but was able to engage Turnus in personal combat and strike him down. Aeneas killed his enemy in the name of Pallas and sacrificed his body to the shade of his dead ally. No longer opposed by Turnus, Aeneas was now free to marry Lavinia and establish his long-promised new nation. This was Rome, the mistress of the ancient world.